The Antebellum South reveals a particularly grim narrative when we turn our gaze to the plight of African women, enslaved, exploited, and stripped of their most basic human dignity. These women endured a life that defies comprehension in our modern era. Amidst the sprawling plantations and the so-called genteel Southern society, African women were subjected not just to backbreaking labor, but also to a systematic and cruel pattern of sexual exploitation and abuse. This was a brutal reality, sanctioned under the twisted norms of slavery, where female slaves were seen as property, devoid of rights and voice. Unfathomable hardships marked the lives of enslaved African women as they grappled with enslavement, forced labor, sexual exploitation, lack of legal protection, family separation, restricted freedom, physical abuse, health neglect, and cultural suppression. These women, however, exhibited remarkable resilience in the face of adversity, resisting their oppression through various means. Today we examine how African women were treated by slave owners and the haunting reality of how such injustices were perpetuated and gone away with. Even the men and women who worked in the fancy plantation houses of the wealthiest Southern landowners, for instance, Founding Father Thomas Jefferson, were not free to make their own choices and were still limited in what they could do and aspire to. Sally Hemings, the woman whose descendants caused an outcry when they demanded to be recognized as descendants, not only of Hemings, but the descendants of the slave-owning Founding Father who wrote these famous words in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sally Hemings was 14 when Jefferson, at 40, took her to his bed. Sally Hemings, who, despite having 6 children with Jefferson, had to sleep in a separate small brick room in the basement of the Monticello. Did she have her freedom? No. And when traveling to France in the early 1790s with Jefferson, she could have stayed and been free, but she elected to return with Jefferson, with the understanding that he set their children free. You see, even the half-black children of Jefferson were viewed as slaves, until he legally freed them. From the Monticello to the fields, virtually no African-American women in the South were free. Enslavement and forced labor. For hundreds of years, the millions of enslaved people, not only in the South but also in many parts of the North for some time, simply eating or drinking often required permission. Working in the fields, enslaved men and women often had to ask permission merely to relieve themselves. Imagine this, being given a name by your enslaver, then being sold and being given another, no one asking your opinion because in truth, enslaved people weren't looked at as people, but as property, to be bought, sold, used up, and disposed of. Perhaps women had it the worst, from beatings to sexual assault and forced pregnancy, separation from their children and, like every other slave, forced to work in harsh, unsafe, and inhumane conditions. Enslaved African women were subjected to brutal forced labor, toiling tirelessly in the fields, homes, and industries without any compensation or rights. There was no finding another job or upward mobility or vacation. Work was 6 and even 7 days a week, though many slave owners allowed for a half a day of work on Sundays, if you were lucky. If you've ever been in the South, especially the deep South states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida, you know that it's hot for most of the year, extremely hot and humid. Going from an air-conditioned office to your car in the lot will cause most people to break out in a sweat. For those not used to it, and even many who are, it's like walking in a swamp. Speaking of swamps, much of the work done by both enslaved men and women was clearing swamp land in their bare feet, surrounded by swarms of mosquitoes, poisonous snakes, and alligators from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week. The sexual exploitation and abuse experienced by enslaved women are haunting parallels to the pervasive issue of sexual violence in the modern era. The historical roots of systemic abuse are evident in the stories of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Sally Hemings. Today, we often hear talk about the long-lasting effects of trauma. Imagine then what memories and trauma lived with enslaved women every day. If you weren't the subject of abuse, you almost undoubtedly knew someone who was, or you had witnessed it right in front of your eyes. Imagine spending the first 12 or 13 years of your daughter's life trying to shield her from these things, only to have her taken away from you to make babies on another person's plantation, maybe hundreds of miles away. That's trauma. Punishment. Enslaved women lived without any legal protection against abuse and violence, their lives completely controlled by their owners. In recent years, once again, issues of criminal justice and legal protections have come up again in the United States. These issues and more all have their roots in the time before the Civil War, when the overwhelming majority of black people in America had no legal protection whatsoever. Perhaps the most famous instance of this came in the Dred Scott decision of 1857, when the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the escaped slave Dred Scott was not a free man. Actually, he was judged not to be a person at all, only property. Given that at this time, most white American women were pushed to the side and had very few legal rights, what do you think African American women had? None. Physical punishment, including whipping and beating, was a common form of control over enslaved women. Sexual abuse also served as a punishment and a regular reminder of the status of a female slave. In some of our other videos, we've told you the stories of breeding farms for enslaved African women and men. Both men and women were required to be healthy and disease-free, and most often, the women and girls sent to places like this or loaned out to a nearby plantation had no clue what was happening to them, until it was happening. Sadly, both women and girls were often used by slave owners, and especially their sons, who often lost their virginity in the act of violating an enslaved woman. Resistance. In the oppressive landscape of the Antebellum South, where the institution of slavery sought to crush the spirits of those in bondage, enslaved women found ways to assert their humanity through subtle acts of resistance. While full-scale slave rebellions loom large in historical narratives, it is the everyday resistance of enslaved individuals, particularly women, that offers a nuanced perspective on the quiet rebellion waged against their dehumanizing circumstances. Enslaved women, burdened with grueling labor in fields, homes, and industries, subtly resisted by engaging in work slowdowns. Rather than an outright refusal to work, this form of resistance involved a deliberate deceleration of pace. Whether in the cotton fields or within the confines of a master's house, these women strategically slowed down their tasks, subtly changing the efficiency and profitability of the forced labor system. Through this passive resistance, enslaved women navigated a delicate balance, avoiding direct confrontation while still reclaiming a semblance of control over their bodies and time. Work slowdowns became a form of self-preservation, allowing enslaved women to endure the arduous conditions while pushing back against the relentless demands imposed upon them. Another form of everyday resistance employed by enslaved women was sabotage. In a world where their owners controlled every aspect of their lives, these women found subversive ways to resist, often by undermining the tools of their oppression. Whether in the domestic sphere or agricultural settings, subtle sabotage was a means of expressing agency and defiance. Enslaved women might damage tools, spoil crops, or disrupt household routines, disrupting the carefully maintained order imposed by their enslavers. These acts of sabotage were not only pragmatic attempts to alleviate the immediate burdens of their labor, but also powerful expressions of resistance against a system that sought to strip them of autonomy and humanity. Violence. In the shadow of slavery, sexual violence was a pervasive and horrific reality for African women in the Antebellum South. Lacking any legal protection and considered property, these women were subjected to the unchecked desires and whims of their masters. This abuse was not merely an act of physical domination, but a calculated method to exert control, instill fear, and maintain the oppressive social hierarchy of slavery. It took various forms, from systematic rape to forced breeding, often resulting in pregnancy and a subsequent increase in the slave population, which slave owners viewed as an economic benefit. The psychological and physical scars of such abuse were profound, leaving lasting impacts that transcended generations. This dark facet of American history reflects a gross violation of human rights, where the dignity and autonomy of African women were relentlessly trampled under the guise of chattel slavery. Enslaved women's ability to navigate the intricacies of resistance within the confines of their enslaved existence speaks to their resilience and determination. In every quiet act of defiance, these women chipped away at the foundations of a system that sought to dehumanize and subjugate them. This has been History on Fleek. See you next time.